The day Russia sent troops into Ukraine, a trader in London stared at his screen and said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "This is going to cost everyone." He wasn't talking about lives. He was talking about oil. Within 48 hours, the price of crude oil jumped over $10 a barrel. Not because a single pipeline had been touched, not because one tanker had been stopped. The oil was still flowing. The fields were still pumping, but the price had already moved, violently, instantly, because of something far more powerful than supply and demand. It moved because of fear. And fear in energy markets is worth more than facts. To understand why war does this, why a conflict in one corner of the world can make a family in Ohio or Manchester or Melbourne suddenly unable to afford to heat their home, you have to understand what oil actually is. Not the liquid, the system. Oil is not just fuel. It is the foundation beneath every price in the modern world. The bread on the shelf was baked in an oven powered by gas, delivered by a truck running on diesel, grown on a farm that runs machines burning fuel, fertilized with products derived from natural gas. Pull one thread and the whole cloth shifts. War pulls every thread at once. The world consumes roughly 100 million barrels of oil every single day. That number doesn't move much. Factories run, planes fly, ships cross oceans. Demand is stubborn, almost mechanical. But supply is fragile. It is a network of pipelines, shipping lanes, drilling platforms, and political agreements that span dozens of countries, many of them unstable. And the moment war enters the picture, traders know that network is at risk. They don't wait to see if it breaks. They act as if it already has. This is how energy markets work. Prices are not set at the moment oil comes out of the ground. They are set weeks, sometimes months in advance, through contracts traded on exchanges in New York and London. Buyers and sellers are constantly making bets about what the future looks like. And when that future suddenly includes a war near a country that produces millions of barrels a day, the bets change fast. Prices surge before a single soldier crosses a border. Russia, before 2022, supplied roughly 10% of the world's oil and about 40% of Europe's natural gas. That is not a minor player. That is a load-bearing wall. When sanctions hit, when pipelines were shut down, when European nations scrambled to cut their dependence almost overnight, the question was not whether energy prices would rise. The question was how far. Germany had spent years building a relationship with Russian gas. Cheap, reliable, piped directly in. It made German manufacturing competitive, kept household bills low, and quietly became one of the pillars of the largest economy in Europe. Then, in the space of a few months, that pillar was gone. Germany was paying 5 times more for liquefied natural gas, shipped in on tankers from the United States and Qatar, converted at terminals that barely existed 2 years earlier. The transition was not smooth. It was a controlled emergency. That emergency had a price. It always does. And it didn't stay in Germany. Energy markets are global. When Europe started buying every available cargo of liquefied gas it could find, it drove up prices for buyers in Asia, in South America, in developing nations that had no political voice in the conflict but bore the economic weight of it regardless. A war in Eastern Europe caused power cuts in Pakistan. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. The Middle East adds another layer entirely. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is where roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through every single day. 20%. One choke point. Every time tension rises in that region, every time an Iranian general makes a statement, every time a tanker is seized or a drone strikes a refinery, that number, 20%, hangs over the markets like a warning. It has never been fully blocked, but the possibility alone is enough to move prices. In 1973, Arab nations cut oil exports to countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States, the Netherlands, and others found themselves facing an embargo they had not prepared for. Oil prices quadrupled in months. Petrol stations ran dry, cars lined up for blocks. A speed limit of 55 miles per hour was imposed across American highways, not for safety, but to conserve fuel. The president addressed the nation and asked people to turn their thermostats down and stop decorating for Christmas. The wealthiest country on earth was rationing energy because of a conflict it was not directly fighting. That was the moment the world understood, or should have understood, that energy and war are not separate subjects. The chain reaction that follows an energy price shock is slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. Fuel costs rise. Trucking companies pass that cost to retailers. Retailers pass it to consumers. Farmers, who need fuel for machines and natural gas for fertilizer, raise food prices. Airlines add surcharges. Utility companies hike bills. Central banks watch inflation climb and raise interest rates to cool it down. Higher interest rates mean more expensive mortgages, more expensive loans, slower business investment. A family in Canada that has nothing to do with a war in the Middle East finds itself paying more for groceries, more for rent, more for everything because the price of a barrel of oil moved. The people who understand this earliest are not politicians or news anchors. They are the traders, the hedge funds, the commodity desks at the big banks. They see it in the futures markets before it reaches the headlines, and by the time the average person feels it in their wallet, those who moved early have already positioned themselves. War, for them, is not a catastrophe, it is information. There's a phrase used quietly in trading circles, crisis alpha. It means the profit generated during periods of extreme volatility and fear. When prices swing violently, when the world is uncertain, when ordinary investors panic and sell, there are funds specifically built to capture those swings. They don't cause wars, but they are ready for them. The governments that remain most insulated from all of this are the ones that saw it coming a long time ago. Norway sits on one of the largest sovereign wealth funds ever created, built entirely from oil revenue, invested globally, managed conservatively. When energy prices surge, Norway doesn't panic, it profits. When the rest of Europe scrambled for alternative gas supplies, Norway was already one of the primary alternatives. It had spent decades building pipeline infrastructure to serve exactly that moment. The countries with no oil, no fund, and no alternatives simply absorbed the blow. Sri Lanka, in 2022, ran out of fuel almost entirely. Not because of war on its soil, because global energy prices rose faster than its foreign currency reserves could handle. The government couldn't afford to buy the oil needed to keep power stations running. Hospitals operated on backup generators. Queues at petrol stations stretched for miles. The president fled the country. The connection between a war in Eastern Europe and a president fleeing a palace in Colombo is not obvious. It requires following the chain, link by link, through shipping routes, currency values, import costs, and the brutal arithmetic of a country that imports everything it burns. But the chain is real, and it connects more places than most people ever realize. War doesn't just destroy the places it touches, it reprices the world. It turns every assumption about what things cost into a question. It reminds every government, every company, every household that the stability they lived in was never guaranteed. It was just the temporary absence of disruption. And somewhere in a building in Vienna, the ministers of OPEC nations sit around a table and decide, quietly, how much oil the world is allowed to have. They do not take votes from the people whose lives depend on that decision. They simply decide, and the world adjusts. The trader in London who spoke those words on the morning of the invasion was right. It did cost everyone. He just forgot to mention that it didn't cost everyone equally.